The Apollonian Answer. I am Rick Rockwell, and with us is the mysterious Mark Brahman. This is, as I said, the Apollonian Answer, and we've been doing a QA, I guess, the last 3 weeks in a row, and it's become quite popular, and we're getting a lot of questions. A lot of people are really interested in Apolloism and symbolism and REM theory in general, so we're going to keep doing this for a while. Today is May 14th, and we've already got some questions queued up. Mark, do you have any thoughts?
No, just excited to answer the questions posed to the Apollonians, which are many, of course, because it's a new project and it's a lot of people aren't familiar with it. So that's why we're here to answer the common questions and the uncommon questions that we receive regarding Apolloism.
Yeah. We need an intro theme song, don't you think?
We do. We're still working out the kinks here, of course. Is it Apollonian Answers? Is that what we decided on? The Apollonian Answer. The Apollonian Answer might be the eventual title of the show. Yeah, we're still working out the kinks. But I think we have I have the lion video queued up somewhere in this platform. I just have to figure it out and play it at the beginning of the show, which I think will be a good open for the show.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I've already got some questions queued up, and we've already got some coming in, so we're ready to hit it anytime you are.
Yeah, no, I'm ready to go.
All right. Okay, so the first one actually kind of dovetails. Earlier in the week, you and I and some other people had kind of gone back and forth on Twitter, exchanging, I guess, arguments and counter arguments on a passage from the Bible. That passage is turn the other cheek, right? And, I won't get into it was quite a long, convoluted sort of back and forth. And without getting too far into that, I wanted to ask you, what's the significance of esoteric symbolism that's not immediately apparent? Like, if say only 3% of the population maybe will understand something or pick it up, what is the value in that? Do these sort of esoteric symbols, are they just more of a flag to fly for like-minded people? Do they work subconsciously? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, no, I think that subconsciously is so the primary value or meaning of what we call REM, or racial esoteric moralization, is to moralize one group and demoralize another group. And it's esoteric because it would appear that the premise of those deploying it is they're hoping to affect people subconsciously. So they're hoping to affect subconscious motives, the morality or the morale of people subconsciously. I think is really kind of the big takeaway, is that they're trying to either demoralize or moralize people on a subconscious level. So to answer your question, esoteric messaging appearing in Jewish art, for example, but I think you can also see it in Greco-Roman art from an Aryan perspective. In both instances, we can call this REM, or racial esoteric moralization, but just operating from two different perspectives. But of course, we also see what we would call gem in the Greco-Roman world as well, where messaging is coming from a Jewish or proto-Jewish perspective. But yeah, the goal is to affect the main of the audience in a subconscious way, to moralize one group and demoralize another group. Now, there is also a conscious audience, it would appear, where people, the reason that we know that there is a conscious audience is because we see artists consciously producing REM. In our day and age, it's the most salient cases are among Jews, especially in Hollywood or in publishing, in fiction works, for example. We see Jews using esoteric messaging sounds like a kind of like esoteric, the word esoteric is the correct word, but basically the goal is to introduce subtle messages through careful messaging through the use of language and symbol to create moralizing messages, again, for one group, in this case for Jews, and demoralizing messages for an out group, which would be the sort of larger Gentile group, in particular whites, non-Jewish whites, and yeah. So I mean, Jews are kind of the most presently, they're the most kind of active deployers or users of REM. In their case, we call it GEM, or Jewish esoteric moralization.
Yeah, they're skillful practitioners for sure, and it always it just strikes me as odd sometimes when people will readily accept that these sorts of things are being done right now in television commercials, Hollywood, films, that it's it's ubiquitous in those current mediums, but then are shocked that it would have appeared earlier in myths, fables, and these sorts of things.
Yeah, no, I mean, it
would have come out of that, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that REM theory is, I mean, not to like sort of pat myself on the back or whatever, but I think that we are kind of making a breakthrough with REM theory, in the sense that we are realizing that there is this kind of continuity from the ancient world, and that I mean, I guess there's two aspects to this. One is that we're realizing that Jews in particular, not all Jews, of course. I mean, I think that there's a segment of conscious Jews who we find, especially in art and media fields, as film directors and as screenwriters and this sort of thing, who are using symbol in a very sophisticated manner. In a more sophisticated manner than their Gentile counterparts. Now, we definitely do see some Gentile filmmakers that are using messaging in a sophisticated way. Guys like Christopher Nolan would be one example, I think, and also David Lynch, I think, is another good example too, who is a very highly sophisticated symbolist, I would say. But I think that they have the disadvantage in the sense that I think that Jews kind of have a sort of consensus when it comes to an understanding of symbol language. So they're using symbol in a kind of consistent and coherent manner, which is really, the only way ultimately that it can be practiced in an effective way, right? Because to use symbols in their sort of correct way, with a correct understanding of those symbols. So Jews right now are the real maestros in this regard, and probably whether as Jews or in a kind of proto-Jewish form, have always been. This has always been a kind of field of expertise or excellence for them, since the ancient world. But I think we've also seen periods where Aryans have kind of awoken to the value of religious symbolism, cultural and religious and artistic symbolism, and have sort of deployed it on their own behalf, in protection of their gens and familia. In the case, the salient case that we point to is in the cult of Apollo in the ancient world, but also all the other sort of kind of Aryan celestial cults, in the Greco-Roman period, which would include the cult of Jupiter, Juno. Mars is also another Aryan figure. So yeah, that kind of a long response there, I suppose.
No, that's great. That's it's a nice kind of foundation, actually. So let's jump into some of the questions from the comments. This is from A. I guess, is the Apollonian answer to Q. Can an Apollonian practice witchcraft? What does witchcraft mean in an Apollonian context?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a kind of discussion that's been ongoing, at least on social media, with people that are interested in interacting with Apollonians on the question of, ancient religion, pagan religion. And we do see two trends, at least in our kind of pretty small social media world. So we how significant these two trends are. I mean, we think, of course, our trend is significant because we're optimistic about our movement, and we think that we do have if you want to say it's the correct view of Greco-Roman religion, I think we can just say that we think it will be this sort of successful view of Greco-Roman religion without kind of having that, adding that value judgment, as it were, or whatever. We think it's the right and good way forward, or is the way that holds the most promise and success. But of the two general schools emerge, and I would say that probably the much larger school, I don't know. I mean, there is pagans on the DR, dissident right, sometimes, and I don't know how often, are identified basically as mystics, or are attracted to a kind of mystical element they perceive in pagan myth, which is present, especially in Norse and Celtic myth. I think there's a strong undercurrent, especially Celtic myth, of mysticism. But our view, though, is that we take in a sort of especially Roman view, but a kind of Greco-Roman view generally, that we understand the myths to essentially be metaphors. Like, we understand them as metaphors. We understand the gods to represent concepts. That now this is a kind of separate question from a theological question of whether or not we believe God to exist, or we believe the spiritual world to exist. Apollonians don't actually take, or at least I don't take a position on this. And I think Apollonians in general, though, don't hold a superstitious view of the world. We hold more of a kind of, empirical view of the world, and a non-superstitious, a kind of sober-minded view of the world. And in this way, we see Apollo contrasted with his antipode, Bacchus. And Bacchus is a god of madness and magic, and also mysticism, a personal salvation. He's a god of personal salvation, like Christ, for example, the savior god in that regard. And we take a different view. We have a more, our view is that we believe the world to kind of exist as we perceive it and see it. We don't know what lies beyond the veil or curtain of death. But we don't necessarily take an opinion on. I mean, my personal opinion, and probably many Apollonians share this, and I think it's a kind of sound and healthy position, is that we do believe on some level that we're here for a purpose, that our lives have meaning or exist for a purpose. And the conclusion that we draw is that, well, it is probably the purpose is the most obvious purpose, in the sense that we are also kind of the animal kingdom. And as all animals, we seek survival, success, amelioration, dominance, and that these things are good. And we don't see these things as evil. Now, that doesn't mean that people say that that's a materialist view or a non-spiritual view. I don't think it is. I mean, I think that it depends on also how you're kind of defining spiritualism. We hold gens and familia, race and family, as the most sacred elements, and we don't think that a kind of unseen spirit world, whether in the hereafter or otherwise, it should take precedence over that. We think that we should be concerned with our flesh and blood, as it were, right? So if you're going to call that materialist, I don't know. I mean, I think that sacredness of the flesh and blood, and of the familial and of the race, I think to call that non-spiritual or somehow less sacred than a kind of spiritual worldview or a mystical worldview that holds invisible spirits as more valuable than the perceived world. I think that I think that is a sort of arbitrary distinction. I don't see why that would be more sacred or holy than our worldview, which is we place sacredness in the world and in our works in the world and what we do in the world and who we are and our family and our race. We hold these things as sacred and look to beautify the world and make the world as holy, as sacred as possible. The cosmos, the here and now.
Do you think maybe, witchcraft, mysticism, some of these practices are maybe an attempt to fill a void when there's a lack of tradition or a lack of structure or something like that in a belief system? There's a void in a belief system, and maybe people attempt to fill it with things like that?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue, I mean, without being too, I mean, I think there is a sort of psychological type that is attracted to spiritualism and mysticism. And you might say that, and I think that basically the way that these sort of spiritual movements, at least the potent ones, exist, it seems, is that you have both a kind of shepherd class, a conscious Gnostic who understands on some level that he's dealing in metaphors, that these, when he's talking about spirit, he's talking about a metaphor, right? And then you have a kind of you have a sheep class or a lady who is superstitious on some level, in maybe on this sort of fundamental level, and believes what the shepherd is saying to be true. And these sheep or these lady are much more common, but it is a kind of psychological type, and I would argue it is a kind of degenerate type. And that's not, again, I don't want to add value judgments in the sense that these people are bad or evil or we hate these people or something like that, or we're not on some level sort of sympathetic to them. We don't. I think in the kind of Nietzschean, our Nietzschean view is essentially that we don't. We see pity as a kind of vice or sin, so we don't necessarily. We're not going to like. Throw away our own lives to save, pathetic people, for example, right? Where our first interest is with ourselves and with a kind of amelioration of ourselves, and not to kind of, to get caught up in these sort of pity movements as the left gets caught up in with the, or multiculturalism, where you're placing more value in these sort of, these kind of like, pathetic on some level, Untermensch, who can't take care of themselves, and in the whole psychology is to kind of feel sorry for them and to harm yourself to in a kind of temporary way benefit them. We're against obviously that worldview. But getting back to this, yeah, I think the sort of mystical type, the laity type, is a degenerate type. The shepherd type of that sort of movement is a kind of Jewish type, I would argue, or is a kind of are proto or crypto Jewish, and not even necessarily a Jew himself. I mean, you could have a priest, for example, a Christian priest who consciously understands, who's not a Jew himself, who consciously understands Christianity to effectively be a metaphor, be false on some level, but is a priest as a kind of will to power, to develop a lifestyle for himself, or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, I think that's kind of at the beating heart of it, actually. I mean, a lot of people, when they do these sorts of things, I think it's an effort to transcend a feeling of powerlessness, right? And you see that a lot now. People feel, just through the way they've grown up, or just how powerless they are in the world today. I think they, that kind of forces them to look out for to kind of put their hopes and things in something else that's kind of beyond the physical realm, right?
No, that's exactly right, and I missed that point in my whole discussion. So you're right in bringing that up. That's a great point. And so and also I would say it's a kind of drunkenness, right? So in the way that drugs or alcohol, for example, simulate power, right? I mean, I think that that's really in vice. often you get a sense of power. Pleasure is often a kind of sense of power, and I think that what and I think that that would be one example, is a kind of mysticism or a kind of escape.
It's a more degenerate form of transcendence, right?
Yeah, where you're not like you're simulating a sense of power, but you're not really. It's not really manifesting in the real world. It's not real power in the real world. And I think that Apolloism is concerned with obtaining real power in the real world. Now we understand that
realistically too, right?
Yes. So we understand that not all conditions permit a sort of direct access to power. So we have to be sort of intelligent about the acquisition of power. But that really ultimately, the will to power is also, Nietzsche describes this sort of will to power kind of inherent to everything, right? So a degenerate will to power would be, for example, someone who becomes an alcoholic. That's a sort of a will to power that failed on some level. It was a kind of bungled will to power, if you will, right?
Yeah, or abusive, those sorts of things. I mean, we could actually do probably a great stream on just the dynamics of power, right? And where it stands and objectives, right? All right, I'll blast into some questions. John Sherlock's firing them fast and furious here. So this is from John Sherlock. Did the Romans and Greeks believe their deities to be literally real or symbolic of themselves?
Yeah, so the following is the view held by Apollonians. The gods were conscious, intelligent creations. Now, it seems like a kind of very frivolous comparison, but in the way that a comic book character today is a conscious and intelligent creation, or in the way a character that Clint Eastwood plays in a Western is a conscious and sort of deliberate creation of an artist. This is the way in which I would argue the Greco-Roman gods, for instance, developed. Now, does that exclude the possibility that they were also inspired by heroes and ancient men? No, it doesn't, because that possibility isn't excluded in the other case that I just mentioned with comic books or with westerns or action film heroes or whatever the case may be. Those characters often have multiple influences, and we're beginning to understand too that there's often a kind of very conscious and intelligent symbolic dimension to the way films, for example, are developed. And the same is true certainly in the ancient world, is that the gods were developed in a kind of highly conscious and intelligent way by men who were making sort of intelligent decisions as they sort of design these gods, with an understanding of kind of the psychological effect that they would have on an audience or flock. That's our, now, does that exclude the possibility that some art or some gods were developed in a kind of more spontaneous or organic way, and just sort of persisted because they connected on some Jungian manner? No, it doesn't. But we're talking about a kind of general trend that we see in ancient art and ancient religion, is that it was developed consciously, and that the gods are symbols that represent archetypes, or they represent concepts, for example. And sometimes
probably an idealized concept of themselves, right? And not a false concept. It's easy for people to have a false conception of themselves, but these would be idealized, right?
Yeah, and I think that but I mean, in some cases, so we see archetypes, and the most important archetype that we see in the ancient world is the one of Apollo, who represents this polymathic Aryan figure who is a master of art, who's a master of athletics, who represents a kind of idealized. He's sort of like the Renaissance man on steroids, right? So he represents a kind of idealized Aryan man, and he represents also sort of the varied sort of potentialities of members of our race, of a kind of like Henry Fairfield Osborne would describe the Aryan as a kind of generalized type, right? A type who is a jack of all trades. And we would argue too, and Apollo makes the argument that he can also be a sort of master of all trades. He's the polymathic god, right? And so he's the most important archetype in the ancient world, and we argue, is a consciously developed type to represent an ideal, as you say. But there are other gods that represent concepts. For example, like there's a god whose name means truth, Veritas. It was was her Roman name, and she's a goddess that represents truth. So that's an example of, and some of these in the Roman world, some of the earliest Roman gods were gods that represented virtue or truth. So we see there that clearly the ancients are deifying virtues. They're deifying concepts, right? So we understand, and so we understand them to be constructions, as it were, right? And where we really enter into this kind of the gods are real, and believing in the god is requisite to going to an afterworld, for example. These emerge from the chthonic cults of the ancient world, which Christianity more closely resembles. They emerge from the Bacchus cult, which has many important similarities to Christianity. And one of the similarities was also that it was a personal salvation cult, in the sense that if you followed these mysteries or believed in Bacchus or Dionysus, you would go to an afterworld. And that may have been like a kind of eternal drunkenness or frolic or orgy or something, right? But in Christianity, we see that messaging become more subtle and more attractive to Romans who many of whom who would not be seduced by a kind of more bacchanal messaging, for example, right? Who because of their uprightness. Anyways.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of a sophisticated understanding that virtue is the key to perpetuating the race and the tribe, right? And eugenic ultimately. Now, this is kind of an aside, but it's interesting in Christianity that you find you can commit any manner of debauchery whatsoever, but at the end, if you accept Jesus Christ into your heart, then all is forgiven. So, I mean, that's interesting, don't you think? I mean, it sort of, in a way, it kind of encourages a form of degeneracy as long as you repent at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Nietzsche pointed out that, and I guess we should clarify that. I mean, there are obviously many very virtuous Christians out there, good people who are Christians, and certainly Apollonians believe that. And when we talk about Christianity, we're talking about Christianity. We're not talking about specific Christians. Now, it does seem that Christianity does, like Judaism, it kind of breeds a type. And we Apollonians are not actually, the European man has been Christian for a long time. So no one is kind of unaffected by a kind of Christian breeding that happened in Europe. So we also may have some of what we might call defects, that are a process of this particular breeding, right? Which ultimately, I would argue is a kind of dysgenic breeding. But yeah, so Nietzsche made a kind of wonderful observation. He said that, I don't know if he said, it's a paraphrase, but he implied this at least, and I think he said as much. But that if the Christian is only moral to be rewarded in an afterlife, then it breeds, it sort of tends to breed a kind of immoral type, as it were, right? In other words, if your only reason for being moral or good is to appease this Jewish God and then be rewarded and go to heaven, then maybe you're not a kind of innately virtuous or good person, right? And that's so I think that Nietzsche's implication there is that it would tend to breed an immoral type. Now, that's obviously not to say that every Christian is immoral. Many Christians are very moral, and it might even be the case that certain degenerate types are made more moral through Christianity, for at least for temporary periods in their life, or maybe for their whole lives. Who knows? But if their reason for being moral is only tied to a kind of superstition that they're going to go to hell if they're not moral, then really how moral are those people? Like, in other words, would they not be moral if they wouldn't go to hell? So those are kind of interesting sort of philosophical questions that Anichi posed.
Speaking of philosophers, John Sherlock asks, do you think the philosophy of Heidegger would be good to use in combination with Apolloism? He taught that Western metaphysics went wrong from Plato and was politically aligned with the right people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is some value to. I have to admit that I'm not steeped in his philosophy. I have some familiarity with it, but he does say some good things. I mean, I found that some of his stuff I do find massively relevant. I have to be honest with you, and I don't find him as relevant as Nietzsche, for example, but. Yeah, he is a kind of ultimately a kind of right-wing thinker. So I think he certainly said some valuable things. But that attack on Plato was an attack that Nietzsche had made previous, and also on Socrates. So Nietzsche was kind of anti-Platonism and anti-Socrates. So that's not to say that he was the only one that. I mean, obviously, in the ancient world, those figures had their critics, and Nietzsche is effectively taking, I would argue, kind of an Apollonian position in that case, where he's going against Socrates and Plato, and Nietzsche saw himself as kind of trying to undo the damage of Socrates.
Right. Will articles from the Apollonian transmission be included in your books?
Yeah, I mean, some of them will be basically turned into chapters for the book. So, but I mean, they're much updated and improved and footnoted and that sort of thing. But they'll appear as chapters in the book. Right. Forms of them will appear as chapters in the book.
This question is from Pazuski. What makes you think that Romans had a similar understanding of race as we do? That's an interesting one. Actually, before you address that,
sure.
One thing I have noticed. I've seen this a lot now in history programs and history channels, is sort of a posturing that Romans would not have understood race the same way that we understood race. Like, for example, Romans would not have seen themselves as white, which, I mean, that's kind of that seems like an odd kind of misdirection, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that's entirely false. But I think that the thing is that so central to the Roman system was family, right? Familia and gens. And often those words are well, not often enough, those words are sort of used interchangeably. So in other words, they understood them as kind of loose synonyms in a way that we actually don't today, right? So in other words, the idea of family and race has been disconnected. But we understand, I mean, people in the alt-right understand that race essentially represents a kind of extended family, right? That's what race is. It's an extended family. The Romans had a much kind of clearer understanding of that. And the Rome was controlled by these families, and the idea is the patricians. The patricians represent the noble families of Rome, and Romulus is understood as basically anointing or electing this sort of the 100 first patricians, the 100 first noble families, and it's only, I mean, you could argue that sort of racial degeneration starts to begin in Rome when it starts to become democratized, and we see a conflict between the plebeians and the patricians, right? And the plebeians start to gain political rights vis-a-vis the patricians. Now, the plebeians in ancient Rome also were white, right? So, but at some point, the ancient world starts to get a little darker, and the reason this happens is because the religion starts to fall apart effectively. Now, the religion, I would argue that the religion, by the time Augustus appears, and he is a kind of, we talked about this in the last stream, he's a reviver of Greco-Roman religion. And he's one, for instance, who puts a special emphasis on the cult of Apollo. He wants to revive the cult of Apollo. At that point, religion had become sort of forgotten in a way, or the meanings of the myths had become sort of obscure. And so it required a kind of reconstruction. And this was the point of, or this was one of the challenges that Augustus faced during this sort of religious revival. And his effort, which ultimately I would argue was a kind of vain effort, was just sort of reconstruct an ancient religion in Rome, which had Jupiter at the head and included Mars, especially, and also figures like Apollo and Juno and the gods that you're familiar with. I mean, those were in Rome, an ancient civilization. I guess the founding is sometime 800 BC, is ostensibly the official founding, but it is an ancient civilization. And by the time the emperors start to show up, the religion had degenerated effectively. Now, and we see other ways in which, and this is also discussed in the last podcast, so you can listen to that, and I won't go into detail. But also the system of censors was something that was abolished by the rise of the emperors, right? And that was another thing that Augustus tried to cling on to and hold on to. But other degenerate aspects of religion start to develop as we enter the period of the emperors. Now, I think we all have a kind of romantic view of the emperors, and there's a lot to kind of admire about the emperors. In the Alexandria video, I have Julius Caesar is pretty central in that video, because he was obviously a great man on many levels. The guy's will to power was incredible. He basically took over. He completely changed Roman civilization, and he established the emperor system, and he basically took over in a kind of amazing will to power. And at that point, things had degenerated. So the Republic had degenerated. And, and maybe in some ways it was good that he had ascended. But Julius Caesar, the Republican system ultimately is a less degenerate system, I would argue. It was headed by two councils. So there was a kind of a joint leadership, which a kind of control, a sort of system of check and balances, where there were two leaders effectively in Rome and not one, such as the emperor, right? And I think that probably had a kind of healthy and valuable aspect to it. But one of the ways in which the Roman religion degenerates as we enter into this era of emperors is, ultimately would degenerate because they adopt Christianity. So that would be a kind of final degeneration of Roman, Greco-Roman religion. But we see, for example, the phenomena of the God Emperor. That's become a kind of meme in the alt-right or the DR, but where emperors start to become, emperors become themselves cults or become regarded as gods at some point, and in some cases explicitly, right? One of the one of the stories that's told about ancient Rome is that when the Romans had their triumphs after being successful over some Germanic tribe or some Gaulish tribe, they would a slave would stand behind the emperor. I don't know if it was a slave or servant would stand behind the emperor and whisper in his ear, "You're not a god. You're not a god." And so, and it makes sense, because ultimately we as men are not gods, and any cult that would be based on a man, on a real man, not a sort of mythological man like Jesus Christ, that was obviously a very successful cult. And I would argue because it was steeped in this sort of intelligent and coherent gem, symbolism. And that's one of the reasons that it was successful, among other reasons. But the reason that a cult, so a cults based on men die eventually. I mean, they may persist for some period after the man dies, but men are imperfect. And whereas gods like a god like Apollo becomes an ideal, right? And he does a god who we understand as an archetype and ideal is not threatening or challenging to the vanity of men, right? So no one, if someone thinks that like, Richard Spencer or Mark Brahman is getting too big for their britches, or they have these flaws, these personality flaws, which of course every human being does. Well, we're not the cult. We're not, we're sort of humbly part of the cult, in the sense that we're mortals, and collectively, the Apollonian theory is that we form the god, much in the way that collectively Jews form their god, Yahweh, right?
Yeah.
So there is an element of humility, but also pride. We're very we're very proud and prideful of our gens or familia. Anyways.
Yeah. And it's important to also make the distinction between understanding and perception. Now, with your question, would the Romans have the same understanding of race as we do? Probably on some level they would have. Would they have had the same perception? Probably not. I don't even think the Roman kingdom would have had the same perception on race as the Roman Empire, because your perceptions are formed by the context and by your surroundings, which would be changing over time. I mean, you could argue that we don't even have the same understanding of race or the same perception of race as we did 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. That's something that's constantly evolving, right? I mean, what is more or less eternal, though, is an understanding of your people, right? Your tribe and your people. And I think from that perspective, the Romans would have had a similar understanding for sure.
Yeah, no, the whole Roman system was based on gens and familia, right? So it was very, the whole aspect of Roman society was very patriarchal and familial, right? So it was based on family. It was based on noble families. Which again is a kind of synonym of gens. So now what I will say though is that would they be talking about race all the time in the way that we do? They wouldn't, because these things would not be questions, right? So whether or not a Roman is Aryan or white, the word Gentile in fact comes from gens, right? So and that's the word that is used in the New Testament and also in the Hebrew Bible, in translations of the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and that word is derived, from the Roman and Greek word. Gens and gene. It's a different pronunciation in the Greek, yeni. But so there was that understanding. But it's also, they didn't have race politics, because the reason we have race politics is because race is a question. The Romans would have never had the question. They'd be like, of course we're Aryan. Of course we honor our ancestors. The whole religion was based on ancestry worship. So the whole idea that so in other words, an obsession with race on one level was completely ingrained in their entire identity. So they were, when people talk about ingrained racism, right? The Romans were a very ingrained racists, as it were. So on a kind of subconscious level, through their religion, they had a racial identity that didn't even really need to be articulated in the way that we have to sort of grasp and argue that, well, we're white. Of course we're white. I mean, so that's not even a question that would ever enter into their minds. So naturally they would talk about it differently. So racial identity had achieved an unconscious level with Romans. Race for us, we become race conscious, because again, it's a question. We're looking for an identity, so we're like, well, we're white, so that must have some meaning. Romans, that's such a kind of obvious thing, that it wouldn't be a question to Romans. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and they wouldn't have had the same level of subversion, or they wouldn't have had race weaponized against them clearly to the degree that we have here, right? All right. So next question, the three blind chickens. The Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin is critical of fake traditions created by the bourgeoisie to justify their values instead of real traditions. Isn't Apolloism a fake tradition? Is this a problem?
No. Next question. No, I mean, it's, it seems like the question is just a slur, effectively, right? Do you think it's a fake? I don't know. What's not a fake religion, right? Give me an example of a not fake religion. Please give me a fucking example. This is why I hate this question, right? Is Christianity a real religion? Is Buddhism a real religion? Right? So it's the question itself is a kind of slur. I mean, if you're not interested in Apolloism, if you think it's fake, well then, there you go.
It's like the question, have you stopped beating your wife yet?
Yeah, it's just a slur. I mean, in other questions we can address on the stream too, is it modernist? Is it, we already talked about the materialist dimension of it, but one thing I'll say is that at some point a religion has to begin, right? So at some point there has to be a beginning to a religion. Now, we argue this is a revival religion, but we also say that because there has been this this lack of continuity between the original Apollonian cult and today, we're inspired by the Apollonian cult is probably the best way of terming it. And it is also a reconstruction project. So we're interested in looking at the cult and taking the valuable aspects of it and imitating the valuable aspects to the extent that they can be discerned or understood, and also seeing if there are areas where it appears to have become degenerate or it becomes unwise in its development, because obviously the cult died at some point, right? So,
yeah, it did have a good run. And I mean, when people say things like that, like fake, I mean, this was around, 1,000 years before Christianity, 1,500 years before Islam. I mean, this is essentially the organic religion of the Aryan people, the Indo-European people. I mean, this has all come from a sky father, right? This is our organic religion. It's basically an operating system. And this has been broken or discontinued, right, for, over 1,500 years now. So, I mean, it's incumbent upon us to reconstruct it the best we can, but also adapt it. I mean, you wouldn't take, let's say transportation had been completely wiped out. You wouldn't go back to a chariot from 2,000 years ago and say, well, this is the way it should be. No point trying to improve it or trying to understand the mechanics better. I mean, that's, these are kind of obvious things, right?
Yeah, and also, I mean, I don't know if it's Dugin's idea or whose idea is, but the idea that religion would be invalid because it's a bourgeoisie. Well, I mean, first of all, the Greco-Roman religion descends from the nobles. It descends from the patricians, right? So is that bourgeoisie? Do the peasants have to sort of generated from their mystical experiences or some bullshit? No, come on. You know what I'm saying? I mean, the idea is to develop consciously develop an intelligent religion that is useful to us, that is, dare I say, utilitarian, right? Right. But not to worry about, oh, well, what about the peasants and their little folk tales and this shit, right? No, come on. Let's be real here. And I mean, another example would be too, even if you don't want to use the Greco-Roman system because, you've got you think the Romans were evil and they oppressed the Druids or something like that. Well, look at Buddhism, right? Because Buddhism is also is a mystical religion in a lot of ways. The original Buddha ostensibly descends from a noble class, right? He was a noble himself. So does that make it invalid?
Yeah, I mean, throwing out terms like bourgeoisie, it just seems like an attempt to inject a classism in and try to create some division, right?
Yeah, well, and technically, bourgeoisie means middle class, right? So, is the idea that it can't come from the middle class? It's just.
I think the connotation with bourgeoisie is sort of like a decadent class, though, right?
Yes, that's true. That's true.
All right. So John Sherlock says the space program was named Apollo by a Jew in NASA. Do you think he understood that this was an Aryan project inherently?
Yeah, someone brought that up. I don't, that's an interesting thing that I haven't looked very closely at, though. A couple of people have pointed it to me. Yeah, so I can't really say with any authority whether or not the guy was sort of consciously using symbolism. I mean, because there's a lot of ways to kind of look at it. I mean, you could even let's assume that the guy understood gem. He was a Jew, but that doesn't mean that he understood gem and could use symbol language in the way like a Steven Spielberg could, obviously, right? So he could have ostensibly been a kind of unconscious Jew, a Jew we would call a sussman. I mean, after all, his field the guy was a scientist and he was in a different field, but that doesn't mean that he was not culturally sophisticated, because he appears to have been somewhat culturally sophisticated. Just, even just to reference the god Apollo in this context it does demonstrate some cultural sophistication. But if we were to assume that there was some kind of subversive messaging coming from a Jewish perspective with the naming of that, we could say, well, Apollo's going to the moon, right? And the moon is a kind of Semitic symbol. So you could argue it's showing a kind of an end, like, the mission of Apollo is to go to the moon, or the goal is to go to the moon. And the moon, from ancient times, I argue is a proto-Jewish god, Sin Nana. And even in the contemporary context, we see some corroboration for that from Kubrick. We did a podcast on Kubrick, 2001, seems to kind of confirm that view that that the Jewish god is a lunar god. But this is something, other people. I think Evola. I don't know that Evola explicitly stated this, but I think Evola also understood a kind of lunar solar division, and so I don't know the answer to the question. I mean,
maybe the guy was Philo-Aryan, right? Is that even a word?
Yeah, theoretically. I haven't looked at it.
It's funny, you've never heard it though, right? Nobody even knows if that's a word, because it's never really been used. But I mean, you do see this. You see this a lot. This, especially from the Jewish community. I mean, sort of an interest and an infatuation with European gods and things like that, right? They do have a strong interest. I mean, sometimes most of the time it's probably there for subversive reasons, but other times it may be just an infatuation, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly that phenomena exists. In this case, I have no idea. I mean, possibly it's the case. You know what I mean? I mean, he could have, because in other words, he could have just been using the word in a kind of objective and symbolically correct manner, in the sense that he understood. And I don't know how deep his understanding of mythology really was, or how arbitrary his naming of the vessel was. I don't know anything about the guy, but he could have been identifying Apollo correctly as the god of colonizing. I mean, Apollo was the god of colonizing and exploration, right? So it would be correct to name a vehicle that has this goal of like space exploration after Apollo. I mean, that is a kind of symbolically correct way of naming, that vehicle.
Yeah. Eric Mallet, your questions were answered last week, so check that one out. Dennis Fowler, the Romans worshipped familiar lairs, familial spirits. Isn't that superstitious?
Well, look, so here, as far as the question of superstition, so Apollonians don't make the argument that no one in the ancient Roman world was superstitious, right? Obviously, so I think there was examples of mysticism and spiritualism in the ancient world among the Romans. The argument, though, that we make is that, which appears to be clear from the record, is that they were that the upper classes and the ruling elite, the noble, the patricians, and people that were making political and military decisions and cultural decisions were not superstitious, right? In fact, one of their criticisms of Christianity was that it was both atheism, a kind of atheism, because it was denying the Greco-Roman gods, and it was also a superstition. So, and the word there is superstitio. Now, if my Latin is not, there might be a different pronunciation in the Latin, but that's how it's spelled, superstitio. That was the word that they used to characterize Christianity. So they were not a superstitious people, nor a kind of mystically minded people. They were a very kind of sober-minded people, and that really is sort of the impression that we have of the Romans, is that they were kind of a no-nonsense, no bullshit, badass people who just were not fucking around with sort of the craziness that you see even in Christianity today, as it reverted, for example, into a kind of primitivism in American religiosity, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, we can probably bang out 2 more questions. J.A. Kess, what are the parallels between Elysium and heaven?
Well, they're both afterworlds, and probably there is some inspiration owed to Elysium. Heaven probably owes some inspiration to Elysium. Elysium, at least some versions of the myth, if not all of them, was understood as, and this is a very kind of interesting fact, is that the king of Elysium, or the king of the afterworld in that instance of Elysium, is Cronus, or Saturn, right? So there we have, again, our Jewish friend who is, or proto-Jewish friend, who is the god of the afterworld, right? So we understand it basically the idea of a personal afterworld, as opposed to a kind of familial or racial afterworld, which is what we're kind of interested in, is our collective afterworld, which is, through your offspring. So the personal afterworld does appear to be especially a kind of feature of some of these proto-Jewish cults, especially with these dying and rising gods, right?
Right. Okay, J.A. Kess, this one's for me. Rick, if you were given $1 billion to invest in the Apollonian movement, what would you invest in? Well, I think I would choose a country, and then I would set up a lyceum, a campus that draws in students and an associate industry that works with that campus, and then begin developing infrastructure within that country, and probably moving into the political environment there as well.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I agree with it.
Okay, we got time for probably one more. Emperor Justinian rejected Christianity on the grounds of it not explaining race. Actually, that's just a statement. Do you have anything to add to that?
No.
Okay. There's one on Evola. Evola points out that an authentic spiritual tradition requires a continuous esoteric social movement that perseveres across time. You can't just reconstruct a spiritual tradition.
So that's another statement, or?
Yeah, I guess.
No, I guess that's, continue with your spiritualism then, man. Go your way. Right?
Rick, you have brown eyes. No, not really. I have green eyes. I have sea green eyes. They're like the Aegean Sea. That's from Sneed Keck. That's a good name. Okay. Do you want one more question on Nietzsche?
Sure.
Okay. What do you say to the criticism of Nietzsche that he criticized anti-Semitism and nationalism? Is he misunderstood?
Well, yeah, I think he is misunderstood. I mean, there are a lot of, so Nietzsche is a, this is like the subject for a whole podcast, but I'll try to be brief. Some of his language is effectively veiled, right? And it's veiled for political and social reasons. So he basically he does have some sort of positive things to say about Jews, but I think in a lot of cases they're very sort of kind of measured things that in a lot of cases we can agree with. I think that, but he also points out some things about Jews that would be very kind of so-called anti-Semitic or subversive to point out today. So to call him philo-Semitic is incorrect. I mean, it reveals that the person actually hasn't read Nietzsche or hasn't read enough of Nietzsche, so is just not familiar with what Nietzsche had to say. As far as him being an anti-nationalist, I think that was the other part of the question. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that his view was a kind of pan-European view ultimately, and that's our view as well. So we're ultimately anti-nationalists as well. I mean, we don't really see the point to kind of modern nation states right now, and they're kind of all of them have these corrupt governments that are against the native populations, anyways, right? And we also see that. Oh, please.
Sorry, I was just going to say I think that actually showed a lot of foresight on his part. That he was recognizing petty nationalism as something that was ultimately, counterproductive or even destructive, right?
Yeah, no, he was a critic of petty nationalism, and that was the correct view. And I mean, I guess the most cataclysmic example of petty nationalism not working would be the world wars, right? I mean, obviously those were cataclysmic, and they sort of led us to the position that we're in now. So petty nationalism doesn't work. Petty nationalism should be discarded. Now, does that mean does that mean that we hate all petty nationalists? No, we don't. I mean, and I think that there is a kind of value in, or do we, can petty nationalism sort of serve our ends in some cases? I think it can in some cases, but it doesn't have the sort of ultimate same goal or objective. The other thing too is I think that you might be able to make a distinction between localism and petty nationalism in the following sense that, like, I think that it is valuable to have people who are kind of, and I would argue ultimately to have Apollonians throughout the world who are connected to local populations and can relate in an effective way to local populations. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think people need to recognize as well that nationalism, 150 years ago is a lot different than what it would be today. I mean, you tell me, how far a country like Estonia or Latvia is going to get with nationalism. I mean, they're really not effectively in control of their countries anymore. This is just the dynamics of the world, the way geopolitics works. It's things change, right? And petty nationalism, I don't want to overuse that term, but it's really becoming irrelevant.
Yeah, no, it is.
Yeah, we have a lot more questions coming in, but we're going to cut it off. We said we cut it off at a hard hour. And do you have anything to say, Mark, before we sign off?
No, good discussion. Yeah, and guys, you can queue up your questions like a week beforehand if you want. I'll start getting in the habit of just like putting up this stream. I'm going to be going on a little vacation soon, so I think the schedule over the next 3 weeks or so, I'm going to play it a little bit by ear, but I'm going to try and do a stream once a week, even while on vacation. Just take an hour and pop out a stream. But just heads up on that. But then I'll be back full force.
Are you going to Rome?
I'm going to one of the ancient realms. I'll have some good stuff. What?
Carthage?
I'll be in the Mediterranean. That's the clue and it's not Rome, so you probably can figure it out. But what I will say though is that I am looking forward to because I've been reading a little bit of the guidebooks. I haven't really got into the guidebooks, but there's so much, like, even looking at the ancient ruins, there's so much confirmation of REM theory. I'll just give you one quick example. The plan is to visit Delos, right? Delos, and which is the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, right, or Apollo and Diana, and there you have temples. You have the earliest temples on that island are Apollonian temples, right? But then later you have these. You have later in like 300 AD, you start to see Dionysian temples in there, including where he was the god of the phallus, for example. They would have these parades where the maenads would run around with phalluses. It's very similar to kind of the slut walks they would have with the dildos up in Canada, right? For example, and in fact, who knows? Whoever organized that might even be kind of consciously referencing the bacchanal revelries. But so what you see is that you see later, as things are declining, the introduction of the Dionysian temple. And not only that, so 300 AD, you have the Dionysian temple, and Dionysus across the ancient world was associated with Yahweh. So they, the mythographers understand him to effectively be the same god. 300 AD on Delos, you see the temple of Dionysus appears, and much more ancient are the temples of Apollo. I think maybe even dating back to 1200 BC. Oh, I'm sorry, 300. It might be 300 BC. I'm thinking 300 AD. Anyways, it's much later. So it could be 300 BC. You start to see Dionysus, but 100 years later, after Dionysus, you see a Jewish synagogue on Delos.
Oh,
yeah, there you go. So you see a kind of perfect site. You see the cycle of civilization in the microcosm on Delos, right?
yeah.
Now the island is uninhabited. What?
There's a lot we could go into just on that, actually. So,
but I'll have a better and kind of more thorough report. Once I'm on the trip and checking out the ruins.
Awesome. All right, guys. Until next time. Hail Apollo.
Hail Apollo.
See you later.